Hello and welcome to this week's Israel Insider. Good evening from Israel. My name is Ashley Perry. I haven't been with you for a few weeks because Alex, who was an outstanding stand-in, made clear I had some surgery. Hopefully, I'm on the mend, but this is definitely the longest I'll be talking straight through for well over a month. So please bear with me. And if I'm talking a little bit strange, there's a reason for that. But anyway, we're going to go back to the usual format. I'm going to try and talk for 15 minutes and then we will open it up for questions. Please put your questions in the public chat in Q&A. If you want to chat about anything else, put it in the chat, not in the Q&A, because I'm going to be reading the questions and it will be much easier to just read through them if there's not other issues apart from questions. So there's really only one place to start tonight, and it's the question Israelis have been asking themselves now probably for a good few weeks, pretty much since the demonstrations started in December 2025, going into January 2026, especially with the statement by US President Donald Trump, help is on the way, which is what he said at the time. And there was a feeling that help in the way could mean some sort of attack, which obviously would have an effect on Israel, an attack on Iran, attack on the regime, on symbols of the regime, on the Revolutionary Guards, etc., etc. And there probably hasn't been a week since where there's been some indications that an attack might be in the offing. So again, every Israeli is just asking anyone they can think of. I've certainly been asked by many people, is it happening? And I always basically go back to my one response is there really probably is only one person who knows if and when an attack's happening. And that is, of course, US President Donald Trump. As I said, there are lots of hints, there are lots of ideas, there's lots of analysis, but probably, or certainly the person who will or not pull the trigger at the end of the day is Donald Trump. That being said, tomorrow is a very decisive day. We know that the American and Iranian negotiating teams will be meeting in Geneva for another round of talks. So far, there hasn't been so much movement, but it certainly hasn't been negative. The idea of negotiations as far as Iran has always been a tactic or a strategy to just keep things moving as much as possible, to kick the can down the road as much as possible. Especially in these negotiations, the Iranians know that the Americans can't keep their military buildup, too long. And also, the longer it takes, they feel that they could perhaps wear down the Americans, etc., etc. So tomorrow is a decisive day. The Americans have said it's decisive. The Iranians are coming with some sort of ideas of no longer about what to negotiate, because that was already discussed, and the parameters of negotiations, but exactly what concessions they are going to make. We haven't heard too much of what the Americans are prepared to accept in principle. In actuality, we did hear some behind closed doors sort of understandings from Steve Witkoff, one of the major, if not the major American negotiator. And we heard things like he said that there's going to be no sunset clauses in any agreement. Sunset clause was a very controversial part of the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal signed under the Obama administration, where basically whatever the Iranians committed to, and again, it was a very flawed agreement, within 10 or 15 years, many of the clauses would basically just evaporate and basically giving the Iranians a free range. And that was certainly one of the more controversial parts of the JCPOA. There were others, but that was certainly one of them. The fact that no matter what the limitations on Iran's nuclear program, eventually they'll all just disappear after 10 to 15 years, which is not such a long time. So we see that at least they are learning some of the lessons from the failed JCPOA, but certainly that's not where Israel wants things to be heading, and certainly some Americans as well. what we do understand from the Iranians, at least publicly, is they don't seem to be offering too much new. They are saying, as they've said for decades, that we have a right to a nuclear enrichment program, and we are not giving up on that. And that's certainly something which the Israelis would like to see: zero enrichment. And some prominent American voices over the last, even few years, certainly for last few weeks, have been saying that that is something that they need to be in the agreement. The other sort of issue which is really important for Israel, and what's important to understand, is that there's been a lot of discussions between American and Israeli officials. Even the ones that have been made public, there are many, many visits to DC over the last few weeks by senior Israeli officials, whether in the military, security, diplomatic, or the sort of expertise explaining what is important. One of the things which Israel is trying to get across is there really should be zero enrichment, because enrichment works in a very peculiar way, nuclear enrichment. If the Iranians say, okay, we're prepared to enrich to 1%, that's, from my understanding, again, I'm no scientist, but from what I understand, that's around 50% of the way to nuclear enrichment enough for a bomb. If they say, okay, only 3%, that's 60 to 70%. The last parts, and we've been following this over the last few years, are not as difficult as the first. So if the Iranians try and convince the Americans that we'll only have minimal enrichment, something token, something symbolic, 1%, 2%, 3%, it is highly significant. It's not 1% of the way there. It's 50%, 60%, 70%. So it's very important that the Americans not get swayed by this. On the other hand, the Iranians can, strongly suggest, and with some substance, that up to 20% can be used for peaceful means. Now, we know the Iranians were enriching, and probably are still enriching, far, far beyond that, but I think it's up to 20% or maybe less than that, can ostensibly be used for peaceful measures. So it's going to be a bit of a dance. The Iranians have a lot of experience around this. So it's hoped that the American negotiators are going to stand firm on this, but we should get some idea after Thursday, after the meetings, where this is going, because it does seem like this is the last chance. It does seem that Donald Trump does not have the patience, or perhaps, if we're being less kind, the allowance that the Obama administration gave for the Iranians just to drag things on and on and on. What we do see is that while this is all going on, the diplomatic dance, we do see that there is a massive buildup of forces in the region. It's understood that the American forces in the region are basically as big as they were before both of the Gulf Wars. So they are extremely significant. I did hear one person say that the majority of deployable forces around the world, American deployable forces, are now in the Middle East, or on the way to the Middle East, or a short step away from the Middle East, and can be brought very, very quickly within hours. There are 300 military aircraft, and all of this is really, it's very hard for an independent observer to see how all of this military buildup doesn't lead to a strike, because anything short of some sort of capitulation on a very major issue by the Iranians, would be seen as Donald Trump backing down. And we've seen before that, he's been very strong against some of his predecessors backing down, where they've laid out red lines. So the question is, if the Iranians don't come with anything new and the Americans become, very disappointed by this, what could happen? There are a whole range of options. I'm certainly not an expert on the military elements of that, so I'm not going to get into that. But there has been talk over the last few days of perhaps a smaller symbolic strike, perhaps something to get the Iranians, to the table faster and with more seriousness. But there are those who say that actually that would harden the Iranians, and perhaps they would be saying, okay, we can cope with that, and this would actually basically, those who are against a strike on Iran would say, okay, you've done your bit, now let's walk away. And it could actually hamper what the Americans are trying to do. So there is certainly a debate about that. In Israel, that's something that they do on a countenance. If they're going to do it, it needs to be done properly. It needs to be something game-changing. But it remains to be seen exactly what that will be. Interestingly, there's a few interesting things that have happened last day. Historic things. First of all, F-22 Raptor fighter jets, 12 of them landed in Israel over the last couple of days. This is very significant, not just for the fact that Israel is receiving, it's not getting for itself. These are going to be manned by American forces, and they're American. But this is arguably the first time in history that the US is using offensive forces and basing them in Israel. We know in the past, yes, America has brought Patriot missile barrages to Israel. It helped during the Iranian attack. So did British forces and French forces at one point. And they've done, over the years, some things which have been useful for Israel on a defensive nature. These are, if they will be used, they will be offensive in nature. So this will certainly be historic. And the fact that they are now being based in Israel, because for many, many years, there was this belief that if you have a base in Israel or base significant forces in Israel, this could be problematic and challenging for some of your Arab allies in the region, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and other places that Americans have bases. But what we've seen is really no response to that, which again just shows how the region is changing day by day. What might have been a little bit overlooked with everything going on in the region was a very significant event today. Well, there was two significant events, but one major significant event was the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Israel. He landed in the morning, and he gave a very, very nice speech, and the Knesset spoke excellently, really warmed the hearts of lots of Israelis. Even Prime Minister Netanyahu said it's one of the most emotive and warm visits that he can remember. They did give him a Knesset award, some sort of medal, which apparently he's the first one to get. I'm not even sure when this was invented, but it's very significant, and I'll explain why. First of all, India is a very significant nation, and the relations between Israel and India have only been growing over the last few years. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his speech, talked about, we're doubling this, we've been tripling this, we've been quadrupling that. But perhaps just as importantly, if we go back pre-October 7th, we remember there was a speech by President Biden where he talked about a new transportation channel going from India through the Middle East to Europe, which was going to challenge China's dominance and the Belt and Road that they have, basically capturing transportation and infrastructure in Asia, in Europe, and in Africa especially. And this was an idea, not necessarily by President Biden himself, but one that he announced. I think it was only weeks before October 7th, and India was going to play a massive part, and it was going to go through Saudi Arabia and other countries, and this would lead to normalization and peace with Saudi Arabia. This was a key part of it, and that was all very important. Some suggest, and I think there's some credence to it, that perhaps the October 7th attack was a way to derail these plans, and certainly they did derail them in a significant way. But India and Israel remained close throughout. We received significant support from India when some nations certainly wilted after their warm messages in the days after October 7th. India never did. There was never any boycott on anything. There was never any hold up of anything. And we see, we haven't seen many high level visits since the end of the war. We obviously had President Trump, but this is probably second to that, and it's important. And another reason it's important was a second event that happened today, or third event, which got even less news, is President Herzog in Ethiopia. Now, again, people say Ethiopia, it's an African country, it's not even the most significant African country, but Ethiopia is another very strong and loyal ally over the years, and it's very important when we look at the Horn of Africa, what's going on there, Somalia, Somaliland, even Egypt. There's a lot of tensions there between Egypt and Ethiopia, and obviously we've seen the last few weeks a lot of tensions between Egypt and Israel. So Ethiopia is a very significant and strategic partner, and really together, the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Israel and the visit of President Herzog to Ethiopia can really be seen as a strengthening of a circle of alliances. If we look back to the early years of the state, there was a very significant strategy by Ben-Gurion and others, Golda Meir, to try and strengthen the alliances that they could. Obviously, no Arab nation would deal with them, and even most Islamic nations. So Israel looked to see where it could have allies in the region, and it came up with Turkey and Iran and some others in Africa, and these were very significant, especially during the Arab boycott, etc., etc. We know what happened with Iran. We know what's happening with Turkey. So perhaps to a certain extent, India and Ethiopia are replacing those early alliances, and it's very, very significant with what we see is going on in the region. Closer to home, the most significant thing talking about elections is really, at the moment, there's really in-depth discussions about the date of elections, and I'll explain why that's significant. First of all, the elections have to take place by the end of October. So that's quite a while away, but it's not such a long while away. We take into account some of the Jewish festivals coming up, and then the big holiday in July and August. And then we have the Jewish holidays, and then October with the commemoration of October 7th, and then elections. So it doesn't leave too many opportunities for Netanyahu to call for an election date. And usually these things are worked out very carefully with partners, especially the ultra-Orthodox, because their calendar, while similar in many ways, is also different. And what I mean by that is it's unlikely that there'll be an election date in October because it'll be too close to October 7th. And during that commemoration, there'll be basically everyone will be thinking of October 7th. And the last thing Netanyahu wants going into the ballot box is everyone thinking October 7th, because that was, one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of the state of Israel. And the only person in that level who hasn't taken responsibility is Netanyahu. And it's certainly not going to win him too many votes at the ballot box. So really, then we have to look in September. And really, the last 2 weeks of September are Jewish holidays. You can't have it then. It has to be on a Tuesday, by the way. And so basically, they leave September 1st or September 8th. September 8th is too close to Rosh Hashanah. And those who follow Israel and what's going on here know that a lot of Haredim especially, but not just, many traditional Jews go to Uman in the Ukraine for Rosh Hashanah. There's a tradition by the one of the Hasidic groups to go and visit the grave of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, the Breslov group. And it said that Netanyahu could have a half to 2 mandates in Uman on election day if they hold it October 8th. So that's up. So really, that leaves, September. That leaves September 1st. September 1st is the first day of school. Now, that also has its challenges. Parents who will finally want their kids to be in school, who know that that could extend their holiday, etc., etc. So probably September 1st is looking possible. The other option is having it before the holidays, because you can't have it during the holidays. You can have it during the summer holidays, but there's a lot of people abroad who won't be able to vote, and that could be dangerous for both sides. The other possibility is before the summer holidays in June, and that's one that's being looked at by some. But at the end of the day, going back to the original topic, it would all depend on what's going to happen in the next few days. If there is an attack on Iran, if there is a regime change or some sort of game-changing moment, then perhaps Netanyahu could call for a quicker elections, perhaps in June, perhaps even earlier. But then we have some of the other national holidays. But June could suit if there are some victories, if there is some game-changing momentum, positive for this current government, especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, perhaps he could call it in June rather than after the summer holidays. So, even on the local domestic level, what happens in the next few days will be significant. Perhaps it could be so significant as to change the region, as some are suggesting. But again, it probably all rests with one man, and we will probably have a good idea within the next few days if that's the way we're going. And with that, I'm going to go to some of the questions. Carrie Hillebrand asks, if as seemed likely an agreement with Iran does not deal with the ballistic missile threat, what would Israel's course of action likely be? Well, I didn't speak about this, but yes, for Israel, it's not just about the nuclear issue. For them, just as important is the ballistic missile threat and the support for its proxies, its terror proxies from Hamas, Hezbollah, and others in the region. Israel wants this all to be part of the negotiations. At the moment, it doesn't seem like they are. And again, something that was attributed to, I think it was Steve Witkoff, that first let's deal with the nuclear issue, and then we will deal with the ballistic issue and the proxies issue, and the issue of the repression of the Iranian people. Israel would certainly like to have all these issues on the table. That's certainly the position that Prime Minister Netanyahu has brought up many times with President Trump. It does seem at the moment that it's just a nuclear issue. Perhaps that's a tactic, knowing that that's the easiest thing to sell to the American people. Also knowing that the Iranians are probably not going to compromise even on that. So it's a problematic issue. If Iran does compromise enough that the Americans take this further and there are true negotiations, perhaps even some agreement, without the ballistic missile threat, it's a big problem for Israel, because we do see Iran really increasing its ballistic missile threat. They understand that in the 12-day war last July, that they were able to overwhelm Israeli defenses and strike major targets in Israel, whether it's Tel Aviv, whether it's some of the universities or even some of the bases. And one can imagine if they doubled or tripled the volley each time, perhaps that could overwhelm. And they also know, the Iranians, that it takes them a lot less time, a lot less money to make a ballistic missile as it does for Israel to build, I think it's an arrow system missile to take it out. So they certainly have the advantage there. And that's why they're focusing very much on trying to race ahead with as many ballistic missiles as possible for any possible strike. And that's why Israel is extremely wide and is trying to make sure that the ballistic missile issue is brought up as early as possible. Jose Montero said, good to see you again, Ashley. Hope you're fine and healthy. Thank you very much. AL asks, has the US lost so much of the element of surprise that Iran has had sufficient time? Oh, 1 second. Sufficient time to either harden facilities or move any key assets to secure locations so that any strike may not accomplish much. You're right. This isn't going to be a surprise attack that we saw in July last year. But the idea at this point is to try and put as much pressure on the Iranians to compromise. President Trump has said he prefers a negotiated solution, a diplomatic solution, rather than a military solution, and he's certainly holding by that. Does he believe that they'll get to that? That's another argument. Perhaps he's going through the ropes just to ensure that the international community and his supporters at home, or even his detractors at home, understand that if there is going to be a military strike, it's only after diplomatic, possible solutions have been exhausted. So this isn't about surprise. This is about showing overwhelming power. But exactly when it happens, it could be the Americans will say, well, we're going to negotiate again. There's going to be another meeting, then the attack before that. So there is still the possibility of an element of surprise. And as I said, you could look probably almost every day that something is happening, either more hardware being brought to the region, more American evacuation of bases in Qatar, more evacuation of families, of diplomats in certain areas. There are many signs every day that an attack could happen. So there could still be an element of surprise, but certainly it's not going to be like it was in July. And the main idea at this point is really to push the Iranians, threaten the Iranians, make them compromise by this massive show of force. So that's really, it's a different strategy this time. I think that might be all the questions that I see here. So if there are no more questions, thank you for being patient with me. Again, I know I'm not sounding, normal completely yet. Hopefully week by week I'll get better, but I hope you did understand me and I was able to get my points across. And with that, I'll have to wish you a very good afternoon or night, wherever you are. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you very much.